start this. So let's move on to our tonight's speaker. My name is David J. Canton, president of the Lincoln Group of DC, and we have a great speaker for you tonight, and a lot of people here. I'll remind people that we will keep yourself on mute unless you're asking a question in the Q&A after our speaker speaks. And now I will turn it over to Dr. John Whelan to introduce Andy Lang. Yeah, John.
Thank you. Yeah, we are indeed lucky researching the bio here. It's quite impressive. So Dr. Andrew Lang is an associate professor at Mississippi State University, where he specializes in the history of 19th century America, using the era of the American Civil War as a lens through which to investigate the century's dynamic setting. I should mention that the Society of Civil War Surgeons, I'm a member of that, Civil War Historians, presented his first book in the wake of the military occupation, emancipation, and in Civil War America in 2017 with the 2018 Tom Watson Brown Book Award, the best book published on the causes, conduct, and effects broadly defined of the Civil War, measured by the original scholarship and literary style. His most recent book, A Contest of Civilization, exposing the crisis of American exceptionalism in the Civil War, is published in the University of North Carolina. And that book is his most recent. It's ranked, as one of the 7 finalists for the 2022 Gilder Lehrman Prize. Professor Lang also serves on the Executive Council of the Society of Civil War Historians, as we said. In addition, he sits on the advisory board of the John Now Center at the University of Virginia and the American Civil War Museum in Richmond. And since 2020, he has served on the editorial board of the Journal of the American Civil War Era, the discipline's leading journal. So quite an impressive bio. And I should mention also that he does hold a master's degree from University of North Texas and a PhD from Rice University. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Andrew Lang.
Well, thank you, John, for that introduction and for the privilege of being here this evening. Normally for these events, I'm at my office at the university, but we are iced in Mississippi today, so it is quite frigid out there. And to that end, if you hear noise from the front of the house, that's my 6 and 4-year-olds. So apologies on the front end. I am trying to share my screen to put a PowerPoint on here, but it says that I can't. The host has disabled this. Is there a way that we can fix that?
1 second, we'll get you hooked up.
Okay, thanks.
Should be okay to do it now.
Yeah, there we go. Let's see here. All right, can we see that?
Yes.
Yes, we see it.
Perfect. Excellent.
Perfect.
So I got 2 screens going here, so bear with me for the moment. There we go. We'll do it like that. All right. So this presentation I have tonight is you'll note from my bio that I don't have any published books yet on Mr. Lincoln, but I'm getting there. That's the origin of tonight's talk that I've been doing for the last few years. I thought now that I have tenure at the university, I can do whatever I want, and I've always wanted to write on Lincoln. I figured we need one more book in our library on him. And so I'm working on Lincoln's nationalism, his understanding of history and time, and how nations move through history and time. And what I'm doing tonight is a presentation that I gave in November, several months ago, to commemorate the 160th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. And so, as you can see from the title, I'm trying to look at Lincoln's long-term thinking on what he'll ultimately call the new birth of freedom on November 19th, 1863. But I want to start tonight when the occasion was piled high with difficulty. Starting in that December of 1862, when civil war deluged the nation in blood, the moment at which President Lincoln delivered his annual message to Congress. At that time, as we know, distressing news radiated from the war front. A bruised and demoralized Army of the Potomac shivered in the bleak winter cold, while at home anti-war malcontents barked for peace. The entire edifice of constitutional self-government seemed to stand on the brink of collapse. Meanwhile, the Republic inched closer to the dawn of an unprecedented social revolution. On January 1st, a presidential proclamation would decree most of the nation's bound laborers as forever free. Lincoln acknowledged that moment's overwhelming gravity. Gone were the days of conciliation and compromise that might bind a house divided. As he counseled, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. In his message to Congress, Lincoln asked his fellow citizens to consider something bigger than politics or the destructive war inflicting the nation. He beseeched the people rather to reflect on the process of history, a history that moved inexorably through time, compelling conscious action to once unparalleled, unthinkable forces. By 1862, history demanded that all Americans reconcile the foundational questions of their nationhood. Those questions being, did all people possess an equal natural right to improve their condition, to rise in society, freed from arbitrary coercion or privilege? Must the United States host oppressive racial castes? Do the immutable characteristics of birth consign persons to lifetimes of bondage? Or is it just for one human to dispense of another as a mere article of merchandise? By 1862, these questions demanded of all Americans to rise with the occasion. As Lincoln had it, people had no other option. Indeed, fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. Now, Lincoln's December 1862 message to Congress, I think, anticipated his remarks at Gettysburg when, 11 months later, he would reflect on the nation's new birth of freedom. But ever since the 1850s, I would submit, Lincoln had called for this new birth, or that moment of national reckoning, which compelled all Americans to recover, reaffirm, or recommit to the very history that they had long ignored, but from which they could never escape. And that was the history of 1776, which bound with an electric cord, Lincoln said, the hearts of patriotic and liberty-loving people together. The inability and even unwillingness, however, of Americans in peace to reconcile themselves to history now compelled that they do so through the fiery trial of civil war. And their decisions carried eternal consequences and will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. Sorry, something happened to my screen. Give me a moment. There we go. Lincoln's 1862 remark, fellow citizens, we cannot escape history, may appear self-evident. Did anyone really think, do we even think today that people can escape history? Now, back in Lincoln's time, I would submit that plenty of people thought that they could escape history. Indeed, a diverse cast of Lincoln's contemporaries across the 19th century judged their nation distinct from all other human societies. As Lincoln matured to adulthood in the 1820s and 30s, the American Republic experienced soaring democratization, technological innovation, economic development, and national expansion. In abolishing the vestiges of monarchy, established churches, and aristocratic bloodlines, the American Revolution seemed to have conquered tradition itself. Progress appeared inevitable. Democracy appeared unstoppable. Lincoln's myriad contemporaries thus celebrated what they considered to be their defeat of the past. They believed their union had transcended the course of history. Their republic shone as a providential beacon. Their nation was immune to decay. Their nation was destined to march toward the sunny uplands of civilization. But Lincoln rejected any notion of inevitable progress. Neither nations nor individuals were impervious to the force of history. Indeed, humans could not escape history any more than they could escape their own nature. Like links in an endless chain, a settled, discernible past infused the present. Just as nature could never cease, so too could time never stop. Was not history a product of time, itself a product of nature? This is what Lincoln considered in 1848 when gazing at Niagara Falls. We see a spellbound Lincoln there witnessing history and nature in tandem motion. From the creation of Adam to the exodus of Moses, from the birth of Christ to the voyages of Columbus. Quote, Lincoln said, "Then as now, Niagara was roaring." The living had perished, their earthly existence but a momentary instant in the chronicle of time. But Lincoln ruminated that the great falls never dried, never froze, never slept, never rested. What was their origin? Indeed, what was the origin of history? What was the origin of nature? From where and when did the water commence? Why did the water never cease? Something had to source the natural process. Something had to fuel its endurance. Locating that first principle or original meaning infused in Lincoln the bond between cause and effect. How is it, he asked in 1839, that we know anything, that any event will occur, that any combination of circumstances will produce a certain result, except by the analogies of past experience? In answering his own query, Lincoln looked to providence, or the natural laws that superintended the universe. Law and order, and not their violation or suspension, are the appointed means by which this providence is exercised. His law partner, William H. Herndon, later observed Lincoln's belief that every event had its cause. The past to Mr. Lincoln was the cause of the present, and the present, including the past, will be the cause of the grand future. Everything to him was the result of the forces of nature, playing on matter and mind from the beginning of time. The ordered laws of nature, at least for Lincoln, beckoned humans to act within history and not beyond its fortified limits. Was history therefore an all-consuming force obstructing or eliminating free will? Does the individual have any responsibility for their actions, since those actions seemingly were destined to happen? Do events simply manifest because they were fated to occur? Is the purpose of history altogether different from the purpose of people? Now, these questions, I grant, may imply a depressing existence devoid of any personal autonomy. But Lincoln's fatalism was hardly all-consuming. He never rejected a belief in moral responsibility. He esteemed self-improvement, as we all know, social mobility, human agency. But for him, people appeared within history, impelled by specific motives to order a context fated by history. As he spoke in 1838, from the force of circumstances, the basest of principles of our nature were either made to lie dormant or to become the active agents in the advancement of the noblest cause, that of necessity establishing and maintaining civil and religious liberty. Lincoln further believed that men are made by conditions that surround them, that have existed for 100,000 years or more. Man is compelled thus to feel, to think, to will, and act by virtue and force of those conditions. So what do we make of this? I would submit that history for Lincoln was less a deterministic power than it was a process to secure the moral evolution of societies over time. Humans could discern the logic of nature. They could discern the difference between right and wrong. They could realize what is verifiable by nature. And thus, they could rededicate themselves to natural, enduring, eternal truths. And thus, because the passage of time threatened to fray the bond between the present and the past, human societies had to navigate the enduring struggle between justice and oppression, between progress and decline. Now, it is no surprise to say that Lincoln regarded the political events of 1776 as the premier historical epoch. The American founding, in his mind, aligned in history that which had always been true in nature, that being the inalienable universal maxim of natural human equality. Lincoln read the Declaration of Independence as a civic covenant to chart a new moment in human affairs. For him, Americans had been placed at a certain time and a certain moment to conduct an experiment that they had not anticipated. They claimed, he said, that portion of the earth's surface to organize a self-governing republic committed to individual rights and common liberty. Now, if events drove the dissolution of political loyalty to the crown, then the necessity of history mandated that the generation of 1776 link self-determination with natural equality and political consent. And though the institution of slavery long predated this new political regime, at least as far as Lincoln was concerned, history set into motion a gradual process by which to secure justice and expand the blessing of liberty over time. For Lincoln, history progressed, time progressed, only insofar as people responded with objective moral principle. A principle, he said, tethered by an electric cord that bound the present to the past. But to deviate from this standard, he believed, was to taunt the force of history itself and regress toward degeneracy. And that is precisely what our friend on the screen, Stephen A. Douglas, did in 1854, when his Kansas-Nebraska Act opened the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase, the federal territories, to slavery via popular sovereignty. Now, Douglas, in almost every respect, is a marked contrast to Lincoln, of course, no less than in the way he thought about history, destiny, progress. For Stephen Douglas, slavery was but a mere distraction amid the divine mandate to conquer the continent. Once a people of a territory voted up or down simply through their majoritarian consent, Douglas said, we can go on as we have done, increasing in wealth, in population, in power, and in all the elements of greatness, until we shall be the admiration and terror of the world. For Douglas, the might of a democratic majority charted a virtuous destiny simply because it was a majority, beholden to nothing but the enlightened present. Douglas embodied romantic 19th century obsessions with destiny and prosperity. Indeed, as the noble vehicle of Anglo self-determination, democracy promised to cleanse the world of barbarism. Then, and only then, Douglas concluded, can the United States perform that great mission, that destiny, which Providence has marked out for us. Now, of course, of all the events of the 1850s, it was Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 that fueled Lincoln's political rise. Now, we know all too well that Lincoln opposed the act because it portended to spread slavery into the territories, but that was only part of his calculus. If Douglas's measure permitted free people to vote up or down on whether to enslave another person, then the American political regime Lincoln believed had forfeited its moral authority. The nation now regressed to a medieval age of nobles controlling the land and its bound laborers. The nation now rewrote in real time its founding charters that once promised the hope of something better to all people. The nation now severed its moral order rooted in nature and established by history, claiming now that the unscrupulous exigencies of the present somehow superseded any obligation to the past. Indeed, Lincoln charged, Douglas attempts to repeal all history by proclaiming, quote, that for some men, the right to enslave others is a sacred right of self-government. In Lincoln's mind, Stephen Douglas had authored something entirely novel, divorced entirely from time, history, and logic. It finds, Lincoln said, no model in any law from Adam until today. It exists without a shadow upon the earth. For Lincoln, history had long proven that American prosperity grew from the central idea of innate human equality, an idea that furnished prospect, enterprise, and industry to all. But in Stephen Douglas's decadent obsession with progress, he licensed slavery's expansion, rejected unalienable rights, and thereby degraded all individuals. For Lincoln, history offered an impartial judgment on what he called Douglas's new faith. It was a judgment rooted not only in the aims of Jefferson's American Revolution, but also the inescapable currents of history. When the fathers declared as a self-evident truth that all men are created equal, they consented to a divine verdict that condemned the right of one man to enslave another. As Lincoln said in 1854, these principles cannot stand together. They are as opposite as God and Mammon, and whoever holds to the one must despise the other. In other words, what happens, Lincoln proposed, when a free nation comes to despise objective historical truth, the very truth at the heart of the nation's prosperity, the very truth that offered hope to generations not yet born? What happens, Lincoln continued, when we convict, quote, the first precept of our ancient faith? Have we not cursed our fathers, ourselves, our progeny? To trample on the rights of those around you, defied the currents of history and deadened the national soul. Now, for Lincoln, Americans had long succeeded, quote, in dehumanizing the Negro. But in so doing, they had dehumanized themselves, planting in their midst the demons of deceitful genius. Are you quite sure, Lincoln asked, that these demons which you have roused will not turn and rend you? Proliferating oppression convulsed the nation and welcomed despotism. It was a national emergency, as far as he was concerned. This emergency required some kind of return, quote, to the precepts and policies of the old times. Otherwise, quote, the logic of history foretold the future. As we all know, what comes next? The agitations will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. Now here is where Lincoln tapped the rhetoric of revealed religion to convey a civic theology. In broaching the New Testament concept of a house divided, he asked this question: how does a populace discern and either accept or reject the moral demands of history as it unfolds in the present? When in his House Divided speech, in 1858, he used Jesus's encounters with the Pharisees as his metaphor for the American crisis. Now, to be sure, Lincoln in no way likened the United States to God's chosen nation, nor did he assume the same moral authority as Christ. But the Gospels provided Lincoln a template by which to communicate the implications of historical relativism, moral equivocation, and the denial of objectable, knowable truth. Now, just brief background on what happened in the Gospels. When the Pharisees rejected Jesus's casting of demons from a devil-possessed man, Christ asked, "Why do you refuse to acknowledge that which you already know to be true? That the kingdom of God has already come, that Satan cannot work at cross purposes by destroying the demons of his own creation." At the heart of Jesus's questioning rested an unsettling proposition of blasphemy, or the unforgivable sin that requires intelligent understanding meant to deceive the unwary. The Pharisees operated from considered heights. They arbitrated the faith. They claimed the moral authority to voice what Solomon might call a word fitly spoken. But they blasphemed the Holy Spirit when they knowingly mocked Jesus as a charlatan and his miracles as fake. They imposed purposeful doubts within the hearts of men. They leveraged political and religious authority via raw popular skepticism. The prophecies of history, they said, had not come. The acts that you see before your eyes have not manifested, they charged. It is here that Jesus offered a chilling lesson that Lincoln appropriated. Houses remain divided between deceit and righteousness, and in so doing, the people blow out the moral lights around them. Now, just as Jesus performed miracles to convey God's kingdom was open to all, so too did Lincoln explain that the American political order was open to all. Both required consent. Both required an ancient faith. Both required subordinating self-interest to a collective oneness in the truth. But just as in the New Testament, and this is one of the sub-themes of the House Divided speech, just as in the New Testament, the United States during the 1850s witnessed a band of conspirators who knowingly planted seeds of doubt in the public mind. From John C. Calhoun to Stephen A. Douglas, and ultimately to Alexander Stephens and Jefferson Davis, these collaborators charged that humans were not all created equal, that the objective lessons of history and the founding were not true, that the founding documents did not say what they indeed said, that individual and national prosperity grew not because of innate human dignity, but rather the democratic might of white racial superiority. The lies, the deceit, the blasphemy arrayed against history stained the civic compact. The American House was divided not between diverse citizens of a diverse republic, nor even by the institution of slavery itself. No, the National House divided on the basic yet seemingly impossible question of whether history was true, whether nature was true, whether the generations were bound to transmit something greater than the boundless riches of an uncommon nation. So what to do? Well, for Lincoln to bind this divided house required of all citizens to rededicate to the nation's life-giving principle. I insist, he said in 1854, that if there is anything which it is the duty of the whole people to never entrust to any hands but their own, that thing is the preservation and perpetuity of their own liberties and institutions. In other words, all of us, myself included, Lincoln would say, must rid ourselves from the deceitful spirits from within to restore the original national truth, to recommit to the knowledge that the Republic of Liberty had come. The people must bear witness to the miracle wrought by the American experiment in self-government. Lincoln thus spoke of a repurifying, that's his word, a repurifying of republicanism, quote, in the blood of the revolution, rejecting the hubris of the present, reaffirming, quote, the position of our fathers. Only then will we have saved the nation for the succeeding millions of free, happy people the world over who shall rise up and call us blessed to the latest generations. Now, in this formulation, only a citizenry steeped in the lessons of history could guard against the deceit of the present. Because, do not misunderstand, as was true in the 1850s, is still true today. The present always promises moral superiority, infinite treasure, transcendent power. But Lincoln relied on Deuteronomy 5:9, which warns of the enduring trials suffered by those who fall to covetous idolatry. Thou shalt not bow down thyself unto them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me. Lincoln relied on this passage in many public addresses. Might it be then? Are we really going to go so far as to say that the terrible war that inflicted the United States between 1861 and 1865 was inevitable? That it was fated to occur? I don't know. Perhaps, perhaps not. But Lincoln was certain of one thing. And that was that the slaveholding Confederacy, as he said, promised the approach of returning despotism. The Confederacy drew sustenance and legitimacy from the deceit bred during the 1850s. It brought forth on the continent, Lincoln said, a monarchy that wages war upon the first principle of popular government, that being the rights of the people. In this calculus, nobles controlled labor and habits, customs and language. They consigned all their subjects to arbitrary permanent stations. They governed with imperial appetites, devouring the lands and its resources, and their monarchical institutions, in this case slavery, required unlimited growth, unchecked authority, and unquestioned obedience. Indeed, the Confederacy aimed to eclipse the United States. It existed by waging war against nature. It reinvented the once eternal meaning of divine creation. It rejected the human spirit's innate appeal to personal sovereignty, self-improvement, individual conscience. It was, Lincoln conveyed, quote, for the first time in the world, in the history of the world, an attempt to construct a new nation upon the basis of and with the primary and fundamental object to maintain, enlarge, and perpetuate human slavery. In the name of human bondage, slaveholders now attempted to sever a republic that once existed, Lincoln said, under God. If they succeeded, then they would signal that the natural rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness were not universal, that free government of, by, and for the people was a pathetic adjunct to elite control and hierarchical rule. It was a contest to be sure, between two diametrically opposed societies claiming the same terrestrial space. And when that happens, free republics melt away, despots rise, and strip the people's liberties. In other words, the Civil War came, at least insofar as Lincoln is concerned, because of the American people's complicity in the corruptions of human slavery. They had never accounted, quote, for their past offenses or their faults and crimes as a nation. They never pursued a civic renewal. They never sought political regeneration. They had never claimed the necessity of a new birth. Rather, the American people, Lincoln believed, loitered in the deluded assumption that their nation would continue to march towards some gallant but directionless destiny. They straddled a path now outside the bounds of history, a history by which an earlier generation of Americans had consented to abide. And now they found themselves wandering the bloody fields of fratricidal strife. This was the dilemma, to bring it full circle, that informed Lincoln's message to Congress in December 1862. The currents of history had moved in directions beyond mortal control. Earlier in the year, Lincoln had wondered whether Providence had brought this war upon the United States to account for the people's long misplaced efforts to address human bondage. If that was the case, quote, "In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve." Now, do not misunderstand, here Lincoln spoke not of white philanthropy and black passivity. He spoke rather of a shared humbling. If all humans are created equal, then no person could ever claim earthly mastery over another. Now, that much had always been true, but Americans never consented fully to this logic. But by 1862, history now mandated we must think anew and act anew. We, white Northerners and white Southerners, we, loyal citizens and rebels, all must cure a nation that once declared but had now blasphemed the divinity of all humans. All must see in the enslaved the image of God, and quote, "Then we shall save our country." By the end of 1862, Lincoln was calling for a kind of unity that had never enveloped the American character. He beckoned what the Bible would call oneness, oneness in sentiment and deed, oneness that aligned the people with their ancient faith. Oneness repudiates deceit. Oneness welcomes shared humiliation. Indeed, fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. But even if we can't escape history, we can acquiesce to history, Lincoln believed. We can renounce what he called the casualties and calumnies of sedition, a sedition spurred by the deceitfulness of our own hearts, that these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. That superior wisdom that he critiqued, that had once been the folly of popular sovereignty from Stephen Douglas, the evil vice of human bondage, John C. Calhoun, the mad rush for continental supremacy. But now, history demands, quote, "humble penitence for our national perverseness and disobedience." History compelled, in other words, something we might call a new birth, a collective accounting for the sins of civic deception. Now I'll wrap up here. Might it be then that Civil War arrived as the great equalizer? Perhaps. But in some respects, Americans had always been at war. It might not have been a war of armies, of campaigns, of battles. It was rather a war of conscience, of reason, of sheer dominance. It was a war between the natural rights and earthly bondage of human beings. It was, Lincoln concluded in his final debate with Douglas in 1858, quote, "the eternal struggle between these two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world." They are the two principles that have stood face to face from the beginning of time and will ever continue to struggle. The currents of history had transmitted this struggle, a struggle that began long before Lincoln's time and a struggle that continues long after. It was and is incumbent upon the living, rather, to combat this struggle with ever new births of freedom. This is something that Lincoln understood long before he trod the dark, blood-soaked fields at Gettysburg. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very good. And I'm sure that we have quite a few questions, I hope, um, because I know that the book study forum has addressed some of these issues with Lincoln's fatalism and his vision. So I would say if anybody has a question, either just hold up your hand using the reactions at the bottom, or just open up your mic and ask a question, and I'll, if it gets too busy, I'll go back to the holding up your hand part. Concha has a question. Go ahead, Concha.
Thank you. Your presentation was outstanding. I really, really appreciate sharing all of your concepts and Lincoln's positions tonight. Your connection with the Bible, the scriptures that you selected, are those actually ones that Lincoln picked, selected in terms of developing his ideas, or were those something that you just assumed or added?
That's a great question, and thank you very much for your kind comments. I appreciate that. This is such an important question, and one that I have been working the last 4 months unpacking for myself. I am convinced that insofar as the house divided metaphors are concerned, Lincoln, of course, is a great student of the Bible, both the Old and the New Testaments. The house divided speech itself does not quote, I don't believe, extended passages from the Gospels. That said, the way Lincoln constructed the theme of the house divided speech is very much in line with the way the house divided rhetoric of Jesus appears in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. In addition to which, during the late 1850s, I've done a lot of piecing together what Lincoln might have read or likely have read. And he read several speeches by Theodore Parker, William Ellery Channing, and one other person whom I can't recall off the top of my head, who have extended speeches on the house divided both as a biblical concept and as a metaphor for the slavery crisis. Speeches that are far more explicit, which Lincoln then makes implicit in his own speech. The quote from Deuteronomy 5:9, that is, he uses that almost word for word in the second message to Congress, December 1862, elsewhere that I didn't read from in this paper. But he's very concerned about what the Bible says, how later generations will be punished because of the sins of the fathers, which of course is a great theme in the Old Testament. So, did Lincoln read these specific passages that I read tonight? I cannot say with 100% certainty, but I'm gonna wager, let's say 97%.
Thank you.
There is a book came out last year by Gordon Leidner, who is actually a past president of the Lincoln Group, that is called Abraham Lincoln and the Bible, a complete compendium. And that lists, I haven't read it, which is a rarity that there's a Lincoln book I haven't read, but that lists all of the I believe all of the things where Lincoln referred back to something from the Bible. Are you familiar with that, Andy?
I mean, yes, I am, but I think it's in my office in one of the piles somewhere.
Yeah.
I'm not conversant with it as much as I should be. I'm at present working on expanding this into a full-blown essay for publication. So I will definitely get to that presently.
Yeah, I think it's designed to be a resource of where Lincoln referred to Bible, even if it was not necessarily a quote, but maybe a paraphrase, or at
Sure.
least, like you said, just kind of using words that maybe people would connect.
Yeah, exactly.
The
Yep.
rest.
Yep.
I think Gordon is going to be one of the speakers at the ALA meeting next month, which
Oh,
is
wonderful.
the 17th, the ALA conference. John O'Brien, you have a question.
Thank you. And you make reference to Lincoln's supposed fatal. Where do you, in your essay, to what state of mind regarding that at the time he was issuing the Emancipation Proclamation?
I'm sorry, John. You were breaking up. Can you repeat the question? It might have been on my end. I couldn't grasp it.
Fatalism. I can't reconcile that concept.
Andy, can you turn off your mic while he's asking the question? That might be it. Just guessing. I'm sorry. Go ahead, John.
Lincoln's fatalism. I don't get any much of a sense that this is continued late into his presidency with all the moral concepts that you are laying out there that drove him. Do you have an opinion as to whether or not he was continuing to profess his fatalism with regard to a higher being late in his presidency?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and I do. I mean, I think the second inaugural is laced with it, where Lincoln is just giving up on trying to make sense of the abject limitations of human agency in controlling their moment. He has the famous letter that we all know to Albert Hodges in April 1864. I confess not to have controlled events, but that events have controlled me. That somehow events are manifesting themselves beyond humans' abilities to create them, but in which humans can only respond accordingly. And what I'm trying to work through, and I'll confess, I don't know if I'm right, but what I'm trying to work through is Lincoln making an argument to the American people during this unprecedented cataclysmic event that the Civil War has come and we can only react to the events on the ground with what we already know to be objectively true in nature and in history. And I'm convinced that resonated with him all the way through the end of his life.
In fact, just had, we're reading Redeemed President now, and Alan Gelzo simply repeats John Nicolay's observation that he observed no changes in Lincoln's religion or faith habits over the course of his presidency. I don't understand how people could look at these transformative statements and events and think that he was not different at the end of his presidency than he was at the beginning.
And I'll confess, that's been one of my great challenges too. I'm working through it myself. In fact, I was so humbled by the nature of that question last semester. Taught a graduate course at Mississippi State on Lincoln. And I asked my graduate students to write whether Lincoln changed and evolved throughout his public life or whether he remained consistent. And I wanted to see what they would say because I'm still trying to work it out myself. I can see both. I think I lean toward what Nicolay was saying. I think Lincoln exhibited far more consistency throughout his mature life than he did evolution and growth, even though he might have exhibited specific moments of change that are dictated by necessity. But I think on the macro level, he's more same than he is different by the end of his life, that is. I'm thrilled to know that you're reading Gelzo's Redeemer President, which is just fabulous. I would commend to you all his newest book, which comes out in a couple weeks, Our Ancient Faith, which is about Lincoln and democracy. I'm writing a review essay on it right now for a magazine. It is fabulous. It's maybe 175 pages, and it's quintessential Gelzo. It's just excellent. So there you go.
Yeah, I think that book comes out on February 6th.
That sounds right. Yeah.
6th. 6th. Yeah. Yeah. Asa Gordon, you want to jump in?
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Yes. I'm a um, research historian and curator for the African American Civil War Memorial. A little advertisement. I'll be giving a presentation on to the Rock Creek Round Table, Civil War Round Table. I think it's on the 2nd, 3rd of February on emancipation, a hidden footnote. But the question I have is that did Lincoln in his Gettysburg Address, I contend he raised in his calculations, why did he link the origin not in the Constitution, but in the Declaration of Independence? And in doing so, did he in essence raise the Declaration of Independence as a sort of the civil religion of our nation?
Yeah, I love that question. And your instinct is right on. We'll deal with the first part first. So, why does Lincoln anchor the nation's origin in 1776 rather than 1787? A fun little trivia question. I'll answer that in just a second. Fun little trivia question. In the first inaugural address, he actually discards both of those altogether and locates the Union origin in 1774, as we all know. But that's a different discussion. But it's always the Declaration of Independence. Why? I think the answer resides, I mean, it resides in everything he says from 1854 through the Gettysburg Address. But I think the most pithy explanation comes in his fragment on the Union and the Constitution, January 1861, when he's reading, he's using the Proverbs here, Proverbs 25:11, when he calls the Declaration the apple of gold, encased by the picture of silver, which is the Constitution and the Union. And the reason for that is because Lincoln believes that the nation itself is infused at its bedrock, at its foundation, at its cornerstone, with a natural rights doctrine, for which government is obliged to uphold. So if we locate the Union's origins in 1787, then the nation itself is nothing more than another political experiment on the world stage. By locating it in 1776, it's something genuinely new. It is, for the first time in the history of the world, a nation at least predicated on paper to a creed rather than some kind of political identity, ethno-identity, religious identity. Moreover, locating the Union's origins in 1787 is what the states' rights nullifiers did, and ultimately the secessionists did. If we engage in that debate, then we are agreeing to the legitimacy of their argument. And Lincoln wanted to dispense with the legitimacy of states' rights doctrine, the compact theory of the Constitution, peaceable secession, which he believed to be illegitimate. So when we think about the Gettysburg Address, he is really thinking about this contest that's taking place quite literally on the continent, on the very terrestrial space on which the fathers once declared a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Well, that's no longer a guaranteed inevitability, because nothing is inevitable. Nothing's guaranteed. Because what if the Confederates succeed? Then that means that there is a rival alternative claim to the claim once made in 1776. That has to be upheld, lest it just dissolve into irrelevancy. So that's a haphazard answer, but there it is.
Yeah, and I think his anchoring it into the Declaration had a significant influence on the Reconstruction amendments when Thaddeus Stevens, in the Republican Party picks up on that theme. Do you think he was the kind of origin of, he said, look, this is the way we have, he broke the Constitution and remade it and founded on the Founding Declaration. And to what extent do you think he was influenced on Thaddeus Stevens and in the draft, specifically in the 14th Amendment, I think Thaddeus Stevens links it also to the Declaration rather than the original Constitution.
Yeah, absolutely right. If you read the debates on the 14th Amendment and you read what the authors of the 14th Amendment are saying, they believe that the 14th Amendment is nothing more than a rededication to the Declaration. It's actually fascinating. They're saying that they are bolstering the Constitution in something old rather than creating something entirely new. Even though the 14th Amendment is radical in its own nature because it was never envisioned in 1787, people like Stevens and John Bingham would say, no, what we're doing is ratifying something old and already tried and true. And we're embedding the Declaration into the Constitution explicitly. They would say that the connection was always implicit, but that implicit nature is what caused all the problems in the first place. It just needed to be written down explicitly, and that's what they would say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, we have in just a couple of years, 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the founding of the country. And one of the things that we as the Lincoln Group are looking to do is to make sure that while everybody is going to be focused on the Declaration and Thomas Jefferson and that era, how much Lincoln, make sure we don't lose the fact, how much Lincoln really looked back to that as the guiding star for the country that really defined where we were going. So there's a definite, link with Lincoln and the founding of the country and the Declaration.
Well, so on that point, let's see, what is today? On Friday last week, I and a good friend of mine, we're co-authoring a book on the relationship between Lincoln and U.S. Grant. And the very first paragraph of our book proposal is all about what you just said, David. The whole relevance for this book on Lincoln and Grant and their relationship and their shared vision of what the Union was and why it was meant to be preserved. Our first paragraph is linking it to the 2026 commemoration. So I'm hoping that we can fast track this and get it out for when everyone's talking about 1776. So we'll see.
Any other questions? Oh, go ahead, John.
Yeah, it's interesting. What you said about was it Hay who said Lincoln didn't change, because somebody just gave me a book which I just started, and you probably know this book. It's by Joshua Zeitz, the book called Lincoln's God, where the dust jacket says Lincoln's journey from spiritual skeptic to believer, a conversion that changed both the Civil War and the practice of religion itself. So it flies in the face of that.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that book, and I'll respond in this way. Read some of the reviews of that book in the New York Times, New York Review of Books, and especially the Wall Street Journal review. I think that those reviews are far more on point than the perspective that Zeitz wants to put forward. But he sold books, and so good for him.
Yeah, he wrote the
Yeah, it's nice to be famous already.
He wrote the Nicolay and Hay book. Yeah.
Yeah, which is a great book. I really like that book a lot.
Yeah. I'm wondering, since I didn't see any other questions at the moment, I'm wondering if how relevant is it that today Nikki Haley claimed that we've never been a racist country, and then her staff following up clarified, rewrote what she said and clarified and said that we've had a lot of racists in the country, but we've never been a racist country. Do you understand enough of, from what you've studied, whether that makes any sense to you, and whether you can, it seems like a reasonable argument?
Well, I was hoping that we could get through the evening without lowering ourselves to the primary election nonsense. Especially since, I mean, and that's not the only. I mean, Nikki Haley said some unfortunate Civil War era quotations over the last few weeks. Here's how I will answer it. I think we need to think of it like this. When I said earlier in response to Asa's question, we really do lose sight of the fact of just how crazy something like the Declaration of Independence was and is, continues to be. And I mean crazy in the best sense of the term, how radical it is. And we all know, I mean, the profound shortcomings, realities, experiences of American life from 1776 to today, they are what they are. But here's how Lincoln would answer it. I would point us all to the very middle of his speech in July 1857 in response to the Dred Scott decision, where he explains how the Declaration works, how the nation itself is supposed to work, how the Declaration establishes what he calls, quote, a standard maxim for free society, which should be revered by all, cherished by all, and upheld by all. Lincoln would say that maxim, that all humans are created equal, is that which combats what is also embedded in all humans. The quest to dominate, the quest for superiority, quest to classify, segregate. He would say that's within us all, but we also have the capacity for reason. We have a moral sense about us. And when anchored to some kind of moral sense, he says, that's how societies progress over time. But you have to do so with persuasion. You have to persuade white Northerners, white Illinoisans, just as much as white Mississippians in the 1850s, that the central question is not about slavery's expansion. It's not about the tariff. It's not about anything else. The nation cannot progress, Lincoln would say, before all of us, or at least a majority of us, can agree. Are those words true? Are all humans created equal, or are they not? That has to be step one. Once we can agree on that or disagree, this is the point of the House divided speech, only then can we negotiate politics. So, is the country racist at its core? I mean, Lincoln would say no, because that's not a country worth preserving. Because the country is relevant only insofar as the Declaration's maxim is relevant. It's a maxim that can be proven, it's logical, it exists in nature, it exists by virtue of our reason to understand it. I'll leave it at that. We're only just getting started in this awful year of electoral politics, and so we need to preserve our energy.
Yeah, it's going to be a long year. Let me go to Ed first because and then we'll go to Asa, back to Asa.
One of the questions that was raised in the book discussion group about Gelzo's Redeemer president was, Lincoln was, seems as president, he was constantly frustrated by the fact that poor whites or non-slaveholding whites in the seceded state went along with the Confederacy. They didn't object, although the recent book by Hal Raines points up that hundreds of thousands of white Southerners did serve in the Union Army. But it seemed that Lincoln, throughout his presidency, clung to the belief that these whites, the poor whites, would come around to see the evil of slavery. Did he ever reconcile himself to, or answer for himself, why these people would go along with Jefferson Davis and this slaveholding republic they created? It seemed enthusiastically. I should add, of course, that there was extreme coercion. If you said you were a Republican in the South, you'd be tarred and feathered, driven out of town, if not killed.
Yeah, I love this question. This is one of the few areas that Lincoln just got wrong. He really did genuinely believe that the great majority of non-slave holding white Southerners would themselves rebel against a slaveholders' crusade. They did. There was great discontent and great division within the Confederacy. There was also great division and discontent within the loyal states as well. I mean, upwards of 850,000 white Southerners served in the Confederate Army. A desertion rate of maybe 12%, which means a mobilization rate of 88 to 90%. That's pretty committed. And you read the letters and diaries of non-slaveholding white Southerners, and they are all about the Confederate National Project. They are under what I would say, what Lincoln would say, the deluded belief that they themselves would become slaveholders at some point. I don't think that was nearly as likely as many thought that it would be, but that doesn't matter. They believed it. They were also conditioned, not just them, but everybody in the white South is conditioned by fears of what they would call, in their words, racial amalgamation. They condemned what they called racial miscegenation, and they feared above all a race war. And they believed that this radical Republican, so-called radical Republican Party was bent on race war. You read the secession documents in 1860 and 61, you have secession commissioners from the deep South states going to the upper South states, speaking to these wayward Southerners saying, you got to join us or all this is going to happen. All your worst racial fears are going to come true. On January 9th, I think it was 1863, Robert E. Lee wrote a letter to, I think, his wife. I'd have to look this up. I think it was his wife, condemning the Emancipation Proclamation, calling it barbarism for all these reasons. That sentiment flows all the way down. Now, did Lincoln reconcile himself to this? When you start looking at his plans for Reconstruction, he is relying on those 10% of Southern whites who declared themselves avowedly loyal to the Union, who never joined the Confederacy. And he believed that it would be that nucleus who, over time, through persuasion, through reason, through consent, would build a governing coalition in the post-emancipation South based upon a simple proposition: that you, that I, that we all have an innate natural right to produce for ourselves, to improve our condition. We don't have to rely on the labor of others, that all have the right and the ability, the acumen, the foresight to live independent lives. What Lincoln is discounting, I think, is just how deep-seated race, which here is now an exception to slavery. You read Confederate or post-Confederate, ex-Confederate intellectuals in 1865, 66, 67, and they say, look, we concede that the war has destroyed slavery. We don't really care about that. What the war did not decide is the natural order of race. That's off the table, okay? That sentiment goes all the way down Southern society. I know that we're now dancing around the inevitable question that comes in any discussion of Lincoln. What would happen if Lincoln survived? I don't know. But he'd be faced with this problem for sure. This is the problem of the post-emancipation South. Slavery is excised, but beliefs in racial hierarchy certainly are not.
Let's go back to Asa because he's had his hand up for a while, and then we'll go to you, Nancy, after Asa. Go ahead, Asa.
Yes, there's a new exhibit that's going to be at the museum that's based on a lecture I used to give called the Voting Rights Legacy of the United States Colored Troops. And one in that research and curating for that, I came to a kind of radical conclusion that Lincoln was the first model to Black voting rights. You know, he early on began to realize that not only did he had to call on U.S. colored troops in order to help save the Union, that he would have to call on those of African descent to save democracy. And in a letter to, I think it was to him before the Civil War was even over, I think in a letter said that it would probably help in some, I'm probably misquoting here, in some time come to keep the jewel of liberty in the family of freedom. And he was referring to extending the vote, you know, to those of African descent, especially those who had served in the Union armies. and I think he became a martyr to Black voting rights when he advocated that in his last speech on April 11th. You know, and the same dynamics of politics that is just then came over the election and the election of Lincoln. I found an article at the time says when Lincoln was elected, Ohio carried by Negro votes. Now, this was in 1860, and it was in the Richmond Inquiry. And in essence, it was saying the reason why Ohio was carried, not because Blacks were allowed to vote, and they made their vote frustrated the majority will of what a white-only vote in Ohio would be. And they called, if this continues, this is what we see for the future of this nation. So Lincoln, he becomes a kind of martyr to a multiracial democracy that comes out of the ideal of the Declaration that no other politician had, been an advocate for. And to a large extent, my my research leads to this closing of Lincoln as a conduit predicated on the ideal of the Declaration and the new birth of freedom really being a birth of a multiracial democracy from the monoracial democracy that was grounded in the Constitution and what I call the antebellum Constitution of 1787. Well, that's my reminiscing on it. But to what extent do you think that Lincoln, Lincoln was, defining that new birth of freedom was, in essence, talking about the movement toward a multiracial democracy?
No, I mean, you're not going to get much of an argument from me on that. I'm very favorable and sympathetic to that reading. Now, critics will immediately go to his unfortunate racial utterances in the 1850s. To which I say, look, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, he was born in Kentucky, came of age in Indiana and Illinois, which were hardly racially progressive places. But I mean, yes, politically, on the anti-slavery spectrum, he's right. He's a centrist, right? At least insofar as his political program goes. But in his sentiment, he's very radical. I think with his beliefs on race. I like to think of Lincoln as a radical incrementalist. I think that he always knew what he believed, but he always simultaneously knew that those beliefs were simply impractical for a mid-19th century, either Illinois or even United States, that simply rejected any pretense of biracial equality, much less a multiracial democracy. Was Lincoln working toward this end throughout his public life? I doubt it because of its unlikelihood. But in any war accelerates change, unprecedented change, changes that nobody can perceive. And you talk about Black soldiering. That is absolutely the prerequisite for his thinking. The letter you quoted from March 1864, his letter to the Reconstruction governor of Louisiana, Michael Hahn. He speaks not only about Black soldiers voting, but he also uses a curious word that I love asking my students. What does Lincoln mean when he says voting not only for soldiers, but for the intelligent? Now, of course, we might think, well, educate. And many of the formerly enslaved, of course, were not formally educated. But neither was Lincoln, as we all know.
Right.
When Lincoln uses the word intelligent in any of his writings, or when he talks about education, he's very specific in what he means. If we go to his first political announcement, when he's a 23-year-old, in 1832, I guess, when he's announcing his candidacy for the Illinois State House, he has a whole paragraph on what he means by an educated citizenry. And he says education is when we as citizens can read and digest and understand the history of our country and other countries so that we may appreciate the blessings of our free institutions. I think that's the quote. Well, fast forward to 1864, when he's talking about the intelligent vis-a-vis the formerly enslaved, who in the United States by this point has exhibited such awareness and understanding of the blessings of our free institutions? It's those formerly enslaved men, 2/3 of whom served in the United States colored troops. This is a group of people who have every reason to rebel against the very nation, the United States, that has consigned generations of their people to bondage. But they're not doing it. They're doing the exact opposite. They're saying, no, we're fighting not for the physical nation. I mean, yeah, that's important. But we're fighting for, as you say, a multiracial democracy. We're fighting for the logic of the Declaration of Independence. This is all over their letters. This is all over their entreaties to the president. This is what Frederick Douglass is saying. They themselves, they're not asking for something new. They're asking for something old. So this is what, when Lincoln talks about keeping the jewel of freedom or jewel of liberty in the family of freedom, this is what he's talking about. And I think your point is spot on. It's right. I have no qualms with your position.
Let's go to Nancy, and then after her, Concha.
I've sort of lost my train of thought almost, but I was inspired to speak. I'm an author on Alexander Hamilton and do write about the Lincoln's relationship to Alexander Hamilton and his economic program. And I've just finished a book called Defeating Slavery, Hamilton's American System Showed the Way. And my concern really was brought up by this discussion of what's going to be of the anniversary of the Declaration, because I think as we come to that, yes, absolutely Lincoln's role in bringing that alive and making it revitalizing the connection of Americans to the Declaration is absolutely critical. But it's also critical that we look at this question of the actual history of the fight against slavery early on, prior to Lincoln, prior to the 1830s, in fact, when many historians indicate that's where it began. Because in fact, we always did, I mean, in answer to the question, were we always racist? Well, there were always very vocal and prominent fighters against racial slavery from the before 1800, in fact, I mean before 1700 actually. So it's critical in the book, and I hope David will forgive me for a little promo here, but that people know the actual history of the battle that in fact would have also shaped the thinking of Abraham Lincoln. One of the people being involved having been John Quincy Adams, who epitomizes this anti-slavery dedication to the founding principles of the United States with an industrialization program, which he and many others, Lincoln included, saw as critical to shifting the mindset of the people who are still committed to that atrocity. So anyway, thank you. I don't want to go on too long, but I do recommend that people look at that to get a fuller background and history in the anti-slavery fight.
I really appreciate this perspective. I really look forward to this book too. And kudos to you for this perspective, which I also think is right. And it represents just how misguided and illiterate we are in the 21st century when understanding, I believe, the connection between slavery and the American founding. And here's why. The very first abolition movement political abolition movement in world history occurred in the in 5 or 6 of the 13 colonies, long before the Declaration of Independence was ever written. It had never been an assumption in any human society that government could reject the premise of property in man. Slavery is a constant, natural, normal part of human societies from antiquity to the settlement of the New World. What's weird, what's odd, what's radical is this very idea that no, we're going to use the legislative authority, the consent of the governed, to reject the principle of human property. Now, that doesn't mean that this is the dawn of some enlightened, progressive social age, but what it does suggest is a new assumption derived from the Enlightenment that government does have an obligation to some kind of human right. What does this look like going forward? Well, we know the answer, but Hamilton doesn't have his anti-slavery logic. John Quincy Adams doesn't have his. Henry Clay, a slaveholder in his own right, doesn't have his anti-slavery logic, and nor does Abraham Lincoln have his. If there's not some original proposition that government does not have to sanction human property. This is one of the great questions that's brought to the Federal Convention in May of 1787. Is slavery going to be sanctioned in national law? Is it going to be a national institution explicitly so? Or is it going to be an institution that's continued to be defined by regional and state law? The answer is the latter. And this is the great debate.
Great book by Sean Wilentz on that.
Absolutely, that's what I'm channeling. I was just about to give credit to him, but these are not my ideas; they're his, and he's right. And I love that book. And it gives people don't want to read it. People don't want to read this because it conflicts with what we want to tell ourselves about the founding, about 1776. But I don't know. As I tell my students, let people in the past tell you what they're doing, and let's take them at their word. So couldn't agree more, Nancy. Thank you for that.
Okay, let's go to Concha and then try to wrap it up with John Swallow. Go ahead, Concha.
Thank you. Thank you, David. And again, praises to our speaker. But I wanted to ask the question, when you say, is America racist? Can you not look at all of the institutionalized racism that has been documented and researched in this country? The institutional racism in housing, in employment, in medical facilities. Brown, which of course identified racism in education. So when you look at, is America racist? Don't you have to look at those situations that have been identified with institutional racism?
Yeah, to be sure. I'm not gonna dispute that at all. The way I try to think about it is this. The reason the very real examples that you cite are so visceral is not only because of the human experience in enduring institutional racism, but they're also visceral because they stand in such marked contrast to the principle of justice, natural equality, and liberty that's endowed not only to a certain subset of the population, but is endowed to all. Now, I'm the first to say that institutional racism is a complete rejection and defiance of natural law principles, but does that negate the principle of natural human equality? I don't think it does. And I think the reason we continue to battle against the injustice of institutional racism is because our national DNA says to. If the words in the Declaration of Independence are not true, well, that means that the institutional racists are somehow right. And I'm not willing to go there. And I know, Concha, that's not at all what you're saying. But, you know, yesterday I hope we all reflected on Martin Luther King. But this is the point of the I Have a Dream speech. We've come here to cash a check, but the Bank of Justice is returning the check with insufficient funds. But does that mean that the vault of justice itself is empty? No, it doesn't. And he goes right to explicitly the Declaration and the Constitution. And I think we have to. And this is Lincoln's point. Justice or injustice cannot be combated without a form of argumentative justice against it. And so I do think that, you know, the United States has and has always been a double-edged sword in this regard. It's going to be a very concerning day when the fight against institutional racism is no longer a fight, because that means that we've lost our way in some profoundly disturbing manner. So I don't know. That's all I can offer.
Thank you.
Hi, David. I really wanted to step in on this point of view, because throughout our history, in every single case, there has been prejudice against anyone who's not white European male, from the Native American and even at the National Archives in our history. It's easy enough to find depredation claims and tragic reports of Indians attacking white settlers, but you find very little when it's on the other end of the Indians who have been slaughtered, like at Sand Creek. And it's been very dangerous that when you have people who say, you need to model yourself by our values, because we are going to provide you with a better life with our values. That's when Indian children were put in Carlisle and other schools. They were denied their culture. Their hair was cut. They weren't allowed to wear their clothes, to learn their language, to use their language. And many of these children died. They never got back home. It's been not good for anybody who's been in a culture that's been told by authoritarians that our values are far better than yours. And I think Lincoln has noted this in several of his notes and several of his speeches, talking about the dangers of bigotry, using color as a definition of how people are treated. So just wanted to bring that in.
I love that. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head which letter it is, but when he says that our progress in degeneracy is pretty rapid, I think in 1855, it might be a letter to George Robertson is coming to mind. He's not just talking about the dehumanization of African Americans. He's talking about the rot that is perpetrated by the American Party, the Nativist Party, the anti-Catholic movement, the anti-immigration movement. This is what he's talking about. And this is going back to a few moments ago. This is what makes him so radical. Yeah, we can get wrapped up in, is his program of gradual compensated emancipation, is that the prudent move? Let's set that aside for a moment.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. I mean, he's condemning all of this because if you allow the very simple yet devious proposition that says, I mean, and he even says this in a little fragment, if A can claim the right to enslave B, what right does B not have to turn around and enslave A? I mean, that's what you're saying, and he's absolutely right. Once you justify all this, once you legitimize it, where does it stop? It's not just white versus black. That might be the crisis of the 1850s, but the logic underwriting that is endless. So, oh, thank you. Letter to Joshua Speed. Thank you. I knew I wasn't right about that.
Okay, I'll go with John Swallow, and since John Cooper jumped in, if you both keep it very, very, very short questions, you'll be the last two. So go ahead, John Swallow.
Oh, it's actually two questions. One, Asa Gordon's, that Lincoln was maybe considered a martyr to multiracial democracy. I've been in this group a dozen years or so. It's the first time I've thought that was after he was assassinated, he not only was of this whole hagiography, thinking he was so incredibly great. in the 1800s, 1900s, was there anybody seeing him as a martyr to multiracial democracy, especially among blacks and other minorities? One. Two, obviously, there was a lot more religion in public life, and many more people were devout Christians going to church, much, 5, 10 times more than now. Were there, how many other politicians can people think of that quoted scripture extensively in their speeches on the floors of the Congress? Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, Stephen Douglas. We focus so much on Lincoln. How many others were quoting scripture and using biblical references in their political debates and discussions and writings? Two different questions.
No, and two equally essential questions. So thank you, Don. To the first question, it is remarkable the amount of testimony written by Black Americans, many of whom were formerly enslaved, who do view Lincoln as a martyr for multiracial democracy, not the least of whom Frederick Douglass. Yes, there are plenty of speeches in the wake of 1865 where Douglass is critical, rightly so, of Lincoln. But in so many other instances, does he go out of his way to say this guy was different? He's the first president, first statesman who's ever treated me, Douglass said, like a man. Douglass's best speech on this is from 1880. Yeah, his eulogy of 1876 is wonderful, but there's an 1880 speech. Can't remember where it was given and when it was given, but I know for sure it was 1880, where he makes some pretty radical claims about Lincoln and his legacy and what he perceives to be the lost moment in American life as a result of his assassination, a lost moment for a multiracial democracy. On the religion point, I mean, religion in politics is all over the place all the time. I can abbreviate my answer this way. When we look at the Civil War, just the 4 enclosed years of 1861 to 1865, religion is all over the place. But Lincoln stands out in one regard. What you have in the United States and the Confederacy are leading religious voices claiming with absolute certainty, that our cause is so righteous that God must be on our side. That why wouldn't he be? Because we've chosen the right side, he's on our side, we're on his side. Lincoln departs from this almost from the beginning. He's always rejected that premise anyway, but especially during the Civil War, and this brings us full circle back to the beginning when we talked about Lincoln's meditation on the divine will in 1862. Lincoln is completely uncertain about how God can be on both sides at the same time. And then we know just how mature that thought gets when we get to the second inaugural, when he's almost chastising the nation's religious leaders for declaring that God is on this side or that side. And he's saying we've all been duped by our own hubris, our own religious hubris. And it's a lesson. It's a lesson about religion in civic life, religion in politics. So that's how I answered that.
This is John. So I'd just like to ask you, Andy, from a personal point of view, what's it like to be a Lincoln scholar in Mississippi? I'm a son of the South from Georgia myself, and we kind of like Lincoln down in Savannah, Georgia, where I'm from. So what's it like in Mississippi State? You're muted.
Sorry, I don't want to brag, but I'm from Texas originally. So I've had an interesting life both in Texas and Mississippi. I will confess a point of hubris on my part. So I've been at Mississippi State for 10 years, and I was expecting to have to fight the lost cause battles every day in class. And to my students' great credit, maybe once. Students these days, I have found, especially down here, they don't feel the need to wage all the defensive lost cause stuff. Instead, what I get in my upper division undergraduate Civil War class is something like this. Wow, I've never heard this. I grew up, 30 minutes from here. I grew up near Vicksburg. I didn't know any of this about my state or the South, blah, blah, blah. I want to know more. I didn't know that I lived within 10 minutes of a horrific racial massacre in Vicksburg in 1875 during Reconstruction. So to put it quite simply, it's great. And it's also great because Southerners love their history, and they love history in general, and they love the Civil War. So it's easy to teach, and it's easier and more enjoyable to teach because I teach history the way people in the past lived it. So my students are on board with that. An additional element. Now we can get on a tangent here, understandably so, but I'll just say this. So Mississippi State University is the home of the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library. Yes, you heard correctly. Mississippi State U.S. Grant Presidential Library. If you ever find yourself in Starkville, Mississippi, which there's no reason that you should, but if you do find yourself here, stop by. We can give you a tour of the Grant Presidential Library. It is superb. And we also have the largest collection of Lincolniana memorabilia. I'm sure some, if not all of you, are familiar with Frank J. Williams. We have his whole collection on display.
We know Frank.
I'm sure you do. So I know the inevitable question is why. That's for a whole nother session. It's the oddest place to have this stuff, but it is one of our great crown jewels. I'm honored to be here at this time. I'm one of 3 Civil War era historians in my department. We take it seriously, and we have fun with it, and so do our students.
Well, from what you say, it sounds like change is possible, even in Mississippi. So that's great to hear.
Well, absolutely. And on the front entryway of the Grant Library, there's a really nice plaque that says Ulysses S. Grant comes back to Mississippi, which I think is fitting. So,
well, he did spend a fair amount of time there during the war.
He did indeed. He did
Yeah.
indeed. Yes.
I think Frank Williams went to Mississippi State. Maybe that's why it's there. In any case, I'm going to end this here because we've been here for a long time, and I really, really appreciate you, Andy, for spending so much time listening to some of our questions and answering all of our questions. So thank you very much for being here. We're very happy that you could come.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And thank everyone for participating as actively as you did. That's fantastic. This will be the end of this session. Remember, we have next month, we will have Harold Holzer in person with our joint meeting for Lincoln's birthday on February 21st at Fort Myers. Look at our website for information on it, and then sign up on the Civil War Roundtable, DC Civil War Roundtable website. You can see all the links in there when you go. And we hope to see you all there. So thank you for all for being here, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Okay.
Yep.
David, are you gonna record?
Thank you, Andy. That was great.